Hey, welcome everyone. I'll just give it a couple of minutes to allow people to log on. Okay, well, thank you for joining us today and thank you for joining on time. My name is Amber Bennett. I am the Deputy Director with Re.Climate, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you to Pulling Back the Curtain, the strategy, tactics, and tools of Canada's fossil fuel greenwashing. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and honoring the lands of the Tsuut'ina Nation, where I call home today, as well as the Blackfoot people, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani Nations, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation. These lands care for me and my family, and by extension, make this work possible today. So as you join, I'd encourage you to also take a moment to introduce yourselves and to acknowledge the places and the lands that you're joining us from today. And we will continue to allow people to join. So as you join, I'll just introduce myself again. So I'm Amber Bennett. I am the Deputy Director of Re.Climate. Re.Climate is newly established. We're based at Carleton University, and we are Canada's new Centre for Training, Research, and Strategy on Climate Communications and Engagement. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we provide strategic services to help practitioners reach new audiences, overcome polarization, and communicate the urgency of climate and motivate change. So today's webinar aims to pull back the curtain and take an in-depth look at the strategies, tactics, and tools employed by the fossil fuel industry, often to weaken climate policy, misinform, or greenwash net zero efforts. We have just over an hour, so we've got about an hour and 10 minutes now. We'll finish up by 1:15 ET. And really the webinar today has two parts. The first part includes a presentation of recent research on climate and energy policy advocacy efforts by the Canadian oil and gas sector. That work was made possible by the McConnell Foundation, so just an acknowledgement and a thank you. Part two includes a panel discussion on the report to help us make sense of the findings, not only in Canada, but also globally, and not only now, but to put them in a kind of historical perspective and to offer recommendations for communicators who are working in this space. And finally, we do have some time for questions at the end. With that in mind, I can't imagine any of you have not been on a webinar, but just in case, at the end of your window or at the bottom of your window is a Q&A icon. We'll be using that to track and answer questions. We will use the chat to share links or to share information. We encourage you to do that with each other as well, but we won't be monitoring the chat for questions. So please use the Q&A for your questions, and we've held some time at the end for those. Okay. So in terms of today, one moment, please. I'm looking for a page. Okay. One moment, please. Okay, sorry about that. I have a page missing somewhere in my home. So part one, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two guest speakers. They're the lead authors of a recent report, The Canadian Oil and Gas Industry and Climate Policy, which analyzes the climate-related policy messaging, engagement, and advocacy efforts of the Canadian oil and gas industry. It's part of the Canadian work led by Influence Map, which is a global think tank working on climate and sustainability issues to facilitate ambitious action by corporations and governments globally. Our first speaker is Kendra Haven. Kendra is Influence Map's US and Canada Program Manager. She's a leading research on corporate and trade association influence over climate policy. She has a master's in sustainable development from the University College of London. Our second speaker is Sophia Bashir. Sophia is an analyst assessing the policy advocacy led by oil and gas companies and industry associations in Canada and the US. She holds a master's in international history from Columbia University and London School of Economics, and a master's in development studies from the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. So I will now hand it over to Kendra and to Sophia to kick us off and walk us through the findings of the report.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amber, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. I will start off with our slides here. Great. So as Amber introduced, I'm Kendra. I work with Influence Map along with my colleague Sophia as our US and Canada Program Manager. We'll be presenting today on our recent report on the Canadian oil and gas sector. So just a bit about Influence Map. We're a global think tank that was founded in 2015, right on the eve of the Paris Agreement. We have offices globally: New York, London, Tokyo, Seoul, and Canberra. And we have two main programs, Lobby Map and Finance Map. Sophia and I will be speaking about the Lobby Map program today, which looks at corporate policy engagement or influence. And our Lobby Map database, which is the foundation of our work, covers now over 450 companies and 200 industry associations, many of which are based in Canada. So you might hear in this presentation, Sophia and I refer to policy engagement interchangeably with influence or lobbying or advocacy. We follow a definition of engagement that's based on the 2013 UN Guide for Responsible Engagement in Climate Policy. So that guide lays out all different kinds of ways that companies or corporate actors in general can influence climate policy through public narratives, public messaging, all the way through to direct communications with policymakers, etc. Even advertising is included in this definition. And climate policy is defined as any type of measure, regulation, or legislation, or otherwise that is motivated by the Paris Agreement. So we, in our database, are capturing essentially any type of climate policy that is aiming to mitigate climate change and reduce emissions. Our team is looking at public evidence across a range of data sources that we're scraping on a weekly basis. So this is everything from corporate materials to social media, testimonies that we can find on regulations, CEO messaging, media in general, etc. If it's public, or if we've accessed it, for example, through Freedom of Information requests, then we are able to assess it. And this diagram here just highlights the fact that we see ourselves as a little bit separate from the groups that are already doing a great job of looking at companies' own emissions and their own business models. We are only looking at their engagement with public policy as a separate issue. The other way of thinking about that is a term that that we often use called Scope 4 emissions. So a company's own Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, we're not looking at specifically. We think that their engagement with public policy can be just as impactful on climate change and the energy transition. And we consider that Scope 4 emissions. Every bit of evidence that we look at is assessed on a sliding scale from -2 to +2. So that just means that we're capturing a lot of the subtleties in how companies are positioning on climate policy. And we do this in a couple different ways, looking at how the policy was originally introduced by the government, for example, the oil and gas emissions cap, and whether a company is supporting that level of ambition or attempting to weaken it or even strengthen it. We also take guidance from the IPCC, which is the world's authority on climate change science. And we're looking at what the IPCC says is necessary to decarbonize in terms of specific energy types or technologies such as gas or oil or electrification, etc. All of this information amasses into a profile for a specific company or industry group. So this is just a snapshot here for one company. And there's a couple key metrics that Sophia will refer to a little bit in her presentation. The biggest one is organization score, which is a measure of how that individual entity is engaging on climate policy and whether they are fully aligned with the Paris Agreement or not. So a higher score, 75 or above, is highly aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. A lower score, under 50, tends to indicate misalignment from the goals of the Paris Agreement. And engagement intensity is how active that company or group really is on climate policy. So if they're significantly active, they're going to have a score above 22 or 25% or so. From here, I'll pass to Sophia, following that overview, to just give some more details on our report.
Thank you, Kendra. I'll be giving an overview of our report findings. Okay, so our report looks at the 6 largest oil and gas companies headquartered in Canada. They are Canadian Natural, Suncor, Cenovus, Enbridge, TC Energy, and Imperial Oil. Together, these companies make up to 67.8% of the market cap of GIC's energy sector in Canada. We also look at CAP, or the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, which seems to be the primary body representing the upstream oil and gas sector in Canada. Next slide, please. Kendra, could you move to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, the main finding from the report is that oil and gas sector seems to be engaging in what could be called as net zero greenwashing. Net zero greenwashing was a term coined by the UN Secretary General in November 22 during the release of a research by a UN high-level expert group on credible net zero pledges. Catherine McKenna, who is the chair of the group and also the former Environment Minister of Canada, says, and I quote, "Non-state actors cannot lobby to undermine ambitious government climate policies either directly or through trade associations or other bodies. Instead, they must align their advocacy as well as their governance and business strategies with their climate commitments." Next slide, please. The report finds that the Canadian oil and gas sector seems to be engaging in this net zero greenwashing strategy. What this means is that all these companies have an internal net zero by 2050 target, but all of them seem to be opposing science-based policy to deliver these net zero targets in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming goal. These companies advocate for oil and gas expansion and oppose climate policies. And often they use misleading narratives to push for fossil fuels, claiming the climate benefits of oil and gas. Next slide, please. In this slide, we present Influence Map's ranking of all the entities in the report. Just for a quick recap, the performance band is a full measure of companies' climate policy engagement directly and indirectly through the trade associations. The organization score measures how aligned an organization is on Paris-aligned climate policy engagement, and the engagement intensity shows how engaged an entity is. The table is arranged with the most positive companies at the top, with the least the most negative ones at the bottom. Here you can see that Suncor is at the top with a D+ score, but it still is not a positive position as per our methodology. As Kendra said, we need organization score of at least 75 to qualify to be aligned with the Paris-aligned climate policy engagement. Below Suncor are all the companies almost in the similar range, and at the bottom you can see there's CAP with E- score. You can also see that CAP has the highest engagement intensity of all the entities that we looked at in the report. Next slide, please. The first major finding of our report is that the oil and gas sector is advocating for oil and gas expansion. This table summarizes the engagement on the entire fossil fuel area. Here, the table, the sales label not applicable means that we were not able to find any evidence of engagement from that entity on that issue, and the sales label unclear mean that while we found instance of engagement, the companies have not disclosed their clear position. In the second column, you can see that all the 7 entities that we looked at have advocated for new oil and gas investment. This is inconsistent with what IPCC and IEA tell us that new oil and gas investments are not compatible with our climate goals. In the third column, you can see that CAP and Canadian Natural have advocated for subsidies for oil and gas. Removing the fossil fuel subsidies was one of the priorities of Canadian federal government last year. And in the final column, you can see how companies are pushing for the inclusion of fossil gas as sort of a clean energy into clean energy policies. Next slide, please. Now, moving into a little more detail of what this pro-oil and gas advocacy looks like. A lot of these companies are advocating for new fossil fuel infrastructure. In Canada, this means advocacy for new pipelines, offshore projects, and LNG export terminals. You can see here that CAP had written a letter to the federal ministers advocating to prioritize pipelines and LNG facilities. Cenovus also disclosed in the lobbying registry that they had lobbied the government for investment in an offshore oil and gas project. At the bottom, you can see Enbridge and TC Energy. They're unique because they are midstream pipeline companies and they are opposing the phase out of fossil gas from the energy mix. Next slide, please. Okay. The second finding from the report is that the sector is opposing ambitious climate policies. We took a look at the recently announced federal oil and gas emissions cap and methane regulations. On the emissions cap, we found that of all the 7 entities analyzed, 5 of them have opposed this cap. And on methane regulations, most of these positions are mixed. Here, mixed means that the companies have given both positive and negative positions on this policy across multiple instances of engagement. Next slide, please. Okay, looking into more detail on their opposition to climate policies, as I mentioned, 5 out of the 7 entities have opposed the federal oil and gas emissions cap. For instance, CAP, the Industry Association, and TC Energy have testified in front of the federal government stating that the oil and gas emissions cap would deter investments from in the oil and gas sector. And then the CEOs of Cenovus, Imperial Oil, and Canadian Natural have opposed the cap publicly, stating that this cap is either aggressive or unnecessary. While we didn't find any specific evidence from Suncor and Enbridge while we wrote the report on their engagement on the emissions cap, we know that we have evidence of these companies lobbying against emissions regulations elsewhere. Following the report, 1 month after the report, Enbridge's new CEO, Greg Abel, had publicly opposed the cap. Next slide, please. We also took a look at Pathways Alliance engagement on climate policy. The Pathways Alliance, is a group of 6 oil sands producers that has been gaining increasing traction in Canadian energy policy debates. The alliance promotes what it calls as net zero oil production. What this means is that they're referring to the emissions from involved in oil and gas production, but their communications do not address the emissions that come from the use of this oil or the scope 3 emissions. The alliance's policy positions are in line with the overall industry trends that we noted before. For instance, the alliance has opposed the oil and gas emissions cap. It has advocated for increasing oil and gas production in Canada, both in direct engagement with the government. The alliance frequently advocates for the support for carbon capture and storage, or CCS, and it often uses its support for CCS as a justification to increase oil production in Canada. Next slide, please. The report also looks at some of the narratives that the industry has been using to push for oil and gas in Canada. We were able to delineate 2 predominant claims. The first is a claim that the industry states that Canada's increased production of Canada's oil can help in global emissions reduction. This is based on the logic that Canada has higher environmental standards and that would enable the production of lower carbon oil. And exporting this oil to countries like China, which are reliant on coal, can replace that coal and achieve emissions reduction. It is important to realize that this is a misleading narrative that increasing oil and gas production can lead to emissions reduction. CAP and TC Energy's engagement with the federal government clearly shows this narrative in play. The second is a narrative that has been around for quite a while, but became more amplified after the Russia-Ukraine crisis. The sector argues that Canada has more democratic oil that can replace oil from aggressive regimes like Russia or sometimes even Venezuela. Enbridge and TC's letter to the US government shows how this narrative plays in the US context. Next slide, please. The The industry also engages through other industry associations. As mentioned throughout the presentation, CAP remains the primary industry association representing the oil and gas sector. Apart from CAP, we have Canadian Chamber of Commerce and Canadian Fuels Association that push back against climate policies in Canada. For instance, the Chamber's letter to the government in September 2022 opposed the federal oil and gas cap. In the US, Enbridge and TC Energy are members of the American Petroleum Institute and American Gas Association. Both these associations undertake highly strategic and negative advocacy on climate policy in the US. Next slide, please. Besides industry associations, the report finds that the oil and gas sector also advocates through AstroTurf groups and campaigns. AstroTurf groups are those groups that pretend to be community interests representing grassroots causes, but in reality, they are funded by companies and big corporate interests. In Canada, CAP runs a front group called Canada's Energy Citizen, and this has mobilized public opposition to the oil and gas cap through the ad campaigns. Canada Action is a much bigger front group in Canada, and we found that Cenovus had sponsored Canada Action last year. Fueling Canada is a campaign led by the Canadian Gas Association, in which Enbridge and TC Energy are members. This campaign has been promoting fossil gas as a better residential heating mechanism than clean energy systems. In the US, Enbridge has been linked to two groups. One is New Yorkers for Affordable Energy, which had mobilized opposition to New York's climate plan, and the Minnesotans for Line 3, which has been pushing for the construction of Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota. Next slide, please. That brings us to the end of the presentation. In this slide, you can find information on more resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Sophia. We now have a moment where we're going to move over to a panel discussion, and we do have a time at the end of the panel discussion for questions for all panelists. So I do encourage you to use the Q&A. If there are things that came up or surfaced for you during the report findings or during the presentation, just pop them in there, and we'll be monitoring those, and we can answer them as we get to them. So the next part of today's webinar is a panel discussion, and I'm really excited. We have three great panelists as well to help us make sense of some of the findings and also to share some of the work that they've been doing. So we have about a half an hour for this section. And again, if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A. So today's guest speakers have been researching, they've been thinking, and they've been developing strategies as well to identify and to respond to fossil fuel industry disinformation and greenwashing. So they're going to help put the report that we've just heard about in context. So both looking at what does this mean in terms of Canada, but also how does this look or relate to other findings and other strategies that we see at play in other parts of the world. And then they'll be offering recommendations for how communicators who are working in this space might be able to address this in their work. So our first panelist is Melissa Aronzik. Melissa is an associate professor of media studies in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. She is the co-author of A Strategic Nature, Public Relations and the Politics of Environmentalism. She chairs the Greenwashing Working Group for the Climate Social Science Network. Her research has been profiled on the BBC and in The Nation, Grist, Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, and other national and international outlets. Our next panelist is Chris Russell. So Chris is an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Communications at Carleton University, and he is also a co-academic director at Re.Climate. His current work focuses on problems of disinformation and denial and their relevance to climate action. Chris is the editor of Critical Approaches to Climate Change and Civic Action, which explores conceptual invention in public forms of climate action. Our final panelist is Kara Pike. She is the Executive Director of Re.Climate and a recognized globally as a pioneer in climate change communications and engagement. She's the founder and also part-time Executive Director of Climate Access, a US-based nonprofit focused on building political and public support for climate solutions through its learning network for nonprofit and government leaders, pilot projects, and testing new engagement approaches and communication research and strategic consulting services. So thank you to and welcome to our panelists. I think, Melissa, we'll start with you. And really what we're trying to do in this discussion is to get a sense of, having heard the report, were there particular findings that stood out for you or things that echoed in the work that you do? So over to you, Melissa.
Great, thanks, Amber. Everyone can hear me okay? Great, thanks all for being here. I agree with pretty much everything that's in that influence map report. It's a very good in-depth report, gives us a lot of perspectives and ways to think about strategic communication by Pathways Alliance, by the major oil and gas companies. I would just color in a few things. One thing I want to point out is that all of the tactics that are being explored and expressed in that report are part of long-range strategies. We have a lot of historical evidence of greenwashing. Many of the tactics that are covered in the report go back all the way to the 1970s, if not earlier. And at least in the last 30 years, we've been seeing a growing amount of research on greenwashing, how to identify it, what the mismatch is between these companies' efforts, engagement efforts and advocacy, and their active lobbying against environmental legislation, as well as the goal to just continue to expand fossil fuel infrastructure and production and political contributions to organizations that are opposed to environmental regulation. I think the reason we're talking about it now and the reason we're seeing a lot more of it is that there is a growing public concern with these fraudulent claims to effective climate action, as well as growing political concern. And of course, there's this increase in the volume, the scope, and the potential impact of the claims themselves as climate change becomes more and more a household name, something that we're all more and more concerned about. I also want to stress that we are seeing more and more of these emerging ESG, environmental, social, and governance frameworks to try to address climate change, especially by these corporate actors. And they are, previously we would have seen what was called corporate social responsibility. So a lot of you might be familiar with that term. It's not that different. The way we mainly think about ESG compared to CSR is that ESG is more external, it's more public facing. Corporate social responsibility was usually something that companies did within their firm, and the ESG is kind of the outward manifestation of it. Another reason we're seeing more greenwashing out there, I think, is that it's really not anymore just something we talk about in the advocacy space. We are seeing a lot more in the legal space, a lot more climate liability, accountability claims that are coming forward, financial accountability frames that are coming forward, discussion of the so-called failure to warn of impending harm caused by climate change by companies, along with other climate-related injuries. I don't want to take up too much space. I have a couple more things. I'll just say one more thing, if that's all right, and then cede the space to my fellow panelists. Just one thing I wanted to note about the specific narratives that are in the influence map report, talking about industry narratives. I can say a lot more about that in a moment, but I just want to generally point out that all of the coalitions, Pathways Alliance, all of the companies, CAP, the trade associations, they all work with communication strategists. They are all involved in this advocacy and this engagement, as we saw in the report. And often, and this is where my research really focuses, often these strategists are the ones coming up with the narratives for these organizations. They are the ones creating and managing the AstroTurf groups, the front groups. They are the ones orchestrating, coordinating, and collaborating across companies to get these messages out. So if the messages all start to look a little bit similar, that's one reason for it.
Thank you, Melissa. I'd love to come back to the question of narrative. But before we do that, I'll move over to you, Chris. Yeah, what were the things that stood out for you, and what echoes do you find in the work that you're doing at Carleton?
Yeah, sure. Let me start by adding my thanks and appreciation for this report as well, and to the analysts for what they shared with us today. I think what stands out to me is the interplay between national and international efforts of the oil and gas sector as it's attempting to integrate itself into energy transition narratives, key sites of climate-aligned action, and attempts to take part in the collective reimagining of our renewable energy future. So in this respect, it very much looks to me in the data they presented that we can see the shift from what was traditionally called climate denial, which was about undermining the mobilization of public concern with climate change as a basis for political action, to climate delay, which instead involves the intentional slowing down of the pace and ambition of climate action via policy mechanisms, often in the guise of collaboration, accommodation, compromise. And I think what's important here, what I've been thinking about, is how delay is not just a tactic or a strategy schemed up by those comm strategists that Melissa mentioned, but is also evidence that the oil and gas sector is determined to center and foreground itself as a key participant in climate action in all the places where we are imagining and working out what our future will be. And so this is part of what we're having to deal with. And in many ways, it's funny because the energy transition means so many different things, many technologies in different places, many people have different ideas, and we're having such vibrant debates around how it works and all those kinds of things. But I think the one thing we all know is that it's a transition away from something which is fossil fuels. So the need of the oil and gas sector to sort of put itself back in the middle of this conversation in the political process, I think is not actually that easy a trick for them to sustain for very long, in part because of the kind of work that Influence Map presented. And so I think one takeaway for me is that yeah, there's a lot of money. There's a lot of strategic comms and lobbying. There's confident oil execs, right, putting on TV makeup to say misleading things in very serious voices to journalists who should be asking better questions. There's a lot of advertising and public relations and lobbying. But this is a very risky strategy that they're taking right now to be this visible in their lobbying with politicians and at climate conference meetings. It's not sitting right with everybody. It's very risky for them to be pushing this hard with bankers and investors and the Albertan federal government to sign off on huge amounts of funding for unproven technological schemes, all the while the companies in this sector are accumulating complaints and are involved in litigation that charges them with distortion of public communication. So I feel it's a very risky strategy they've taken to push this line, to claim that there's an oil supply gap that they're going to fill, which is not really rooted in much more than a very provisional hypothetical scenario. And the claims about the world wanting Canada's democratic oil, I think, is the evidence we should look at that a little more closely, because I don't think it's crossed the threshold for reliability. So I think it's risky what they're doing to pursue this net zero climate policy while expanding oil production in a region, the oil sands, that many still consider dirty. And while the international carbon majors are powerful, like Chevron, BP, Exxon, Shell, the oil sands sector in Canada strikes me as much more desperate and volatile, and it's using risky measures to remain relevant to a political and public conversation. So I think there's a key point to continue to push what Melissa said, to sort of take this evidence not as a moment of outrage, but to focus it in terms of the growing movement towards disclosure, transparency, and accountability for harms, and to hold in mind that the oil and gas sector does have the right to say things about climate policy and to advocate for its position, but we need to be more clear about the threshold between free expression and fraudulent claims when you're dealing with the sale of products that have dangerous implications and harms for people. So this all kind of came to the fore for me. I can say a little bit more about the narrative piece as well, and the story that I think is somewhat distinct in the way that they're trying to embed this within Canada and Canadian identity. But I also want to really hear from Kara too.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We're going to come back to narrative. And before we do that, over to you, Kara. I think that having worked on this for a number of decades now, you have some perspective on what this looks like, not only in Canada, but in the States as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate Melissa and Chris's comments. And Chris, I wasn't expecting to feel any optimism today, but the precariousness of this strategy is something really to think about. So I've been working on fossil fuel supply side issues specifically for about 15 or so years now in Canada, but also in the US. And then recently we did narrative analysis in media and social media, also in Kenya, the Philippines, Brazil, and India. And the thing that really strikes me about the influence map report and the narrative elements of that report in particular is how consistent it is with the narratives that are playing out in pretty much every corner of the globe from the industry. And Melissa, your point about why that is the case, but I also think the longevity of those same themes. The industry has been arguing in Canada for clean and ethical oil for a really long time in different forms. And there's a new marketing campaign, sure, that pops up in these front groups. But in essence, they've been using that same framing now for a really long time. I completely agree with Chris that there's been this shift from denial to now we're part of the solution. And I think that's really confusing for folks. It has huge ramifications when the sector is able to lobby for massive investment in carbon capture and storage when that's an unproven technology on scale. And back to the science-based standards, even if it does work, it doesn't actually allow for expansion of production. The promotion of gas as a clean fuel and deliberately using the term natural to confuse people. And we see this in focus groups where people don't know where that falls. Is it clean? Is it not? Is it bridge fuel? Avoiding the issue of production for the most part. So I think that's a lot of what's behind this net zero. It's like, oh, we can actually continue to be the country, to produce the last barrel out there because we're doing it in such a clean way. But at the end of the day, we know from IPCC, we know from International Energy Agency, we can't afford any new fossil fuel projects, and we actually need to ratchet down what is already out there in a pretty significant way. And that obscuring the timeline for action, I see that a lot now where even if, like Shell projection reports will say, like, we're going to see a winding down of oil for transportation or whatnot, but boy, we still need it in plastics and all these other ways, and deliberately obscuring the timeline. And that's not just manipulative, that's dangerous, because we know the timing is everything on this issue. We know that we're on a clock and we're racing, and 2030 just keeps coming at us faster and faster. We're almost there. So I think that's really, it's not just being deceptive, it's actually extremely dangerous to play with the timeline. And it's very intentional. I mean, nobody loves, if you look at the public polling, nobody loves fossil fuels. Nobody wants to be on them. People want the transition, but they don't see when it could happen, how it would happen, and just the viability of that. So they're definitely knowing that and manipulating that. The essence, the arguments that fossil fuels are essential for the economy, for jobs, energy access, key to innovation for the future, massive contributors to communities and community well-being. These are arguments, again, that are going all around the world, and where energy access and security gets very obscured in the case of Ukraine, where in order to meet energy access, increase energy access, we're going to expand gas production in Africa and export that to Europe when there are more than 600 million people in Africa without access to electricity. So it's just a new wave of colonialism, actually, that we're seeing with those arguments. And then using weasel words. And this really was clear. And that's a term from my colleague, Kata Bro, which I really appreciate her using, coming up with. But you see this in COP, you see this in the influence map report, unabated. Like, who knows what unabated means? Inefficient subsidies, right? Using these sort of squiggly little terms to obscure the fact, what is inefficient or not? Canada is subsidizing this industry at the greatest level of any G20 country. So inefficient, inefficient, who cares? We can't keep doing this. So that's another trick that they play. And then constant drumbeat around the alternatives are not here yet. They're not on scale. They're not reliable. They're more expensive. And all of the data shows that renewables are going in the exact opposite direction and typically are the more affordable choice now. And there's been research done in a report called the Fossil Fuel Exit Strategy that shows there's enough renewable energy capacity in every corner of the globe to actually meet everyone's energy security needs, including the millions and millions who don't have that now. So some initial thoughts.
Thank you, Kara. I just want to provide a moment if Melissa, Chris, Kara, if there were particular things that the other panelists had raised in their opening comments that you wanted to respond to, we can do that now. Otherwise, I'd love to dig into the narrative aspect of this. You're okay to move in? Okay, great. So a couple of the questions here that have even come up now really focus on how effective greenwashing has been, with the public, how effective greenwashing has been, whether or not, as a public, people are actually looking for a good news story, to what degree they want to believe that Canadian oil is ethical, that the fossil fuel industry can be a part of the solution, that oil and gas is kind of essential to the Canadian identity. And so I'm curious with that in mind, Chris, I know that you've taken a look at some of the kind of dominant narratives and what that means. And so I'd just like to open that piece up around, there are very effective narrative strategies in play. They appear to be quite insidious. It's like it's everywhere, from astroturf groups to policy documents, et cetera. What is your sense of how effective those are? And what might be some of the ways that in the past they have been successfully kind of undermined those strategies, or what might be things that we can look at moving forward? So Chris, I'll start with you, and then maybe we'll go over to Melissa and then to Kara.
Sure. I think just two quick thoughts on that. One is that I can see why Pathways Alliance, for example, or the oil sands sector might be attracted by forms of public messaging that we associate with greenwashing, because they have probably watched natural gas do pretty well the last couple decades in branding itself as clean, cleaner, natural, bridge fuel, part of the energy transition. And I think it is important to know that they were helped in that, not by just people they hired to craft claims and narratives, but by some environmental NGOs, by government, by a whole host of actors that thought it was a good strategic way to move off of coal. And so I think we're learned that that time is over, but also to think more clearly about fossil fuels as a sector, and to really push back against the idea that one form of fossil fuel is cleaner than another. The idea, and we see this in Pathways Alliance claims around their renewable investments in clean energy technology, the idea that the emissions profile of the oil sands oil has now approached conventional oil reserves, that the work and money that went into that is evidence of clean energy investment. I don't think so. Like, I really think that's something we need to look at and no longer see as a strategic way of moving off of the worst polluting fossil fuel. So a lot of us went along with it, I guess, is one way of saying how natural gas kind of did what it did. The other thing I would like to say is that I think we tend to look at statements and claims and things like that when we look at greenwashing because they're easier to contradict or debunk. And so I do appreciate the emphasis on narratives in this report. And we have a really problematic one circulating now. And it goes something like this, which is that we need to have a rational, pragmatic, measured approach to the energy transition that uses all the tools available to ensure a stable and durable supply that's good for everybody. That's going to mean going a little slower than some would like. It'll mean consulting and collaborating and working with everyone in the energy sector so that everyone gets brought along. This is going to mean having fail-safe mechanisms in place so that we're prepared for what happens in an ever-changing and dangerous world. And given the centrality of energy in our lives, it means we need to give the existing energy sector more time to learn to transition so that we don't draw down from fossil fuels too quickly in case we need them a bit longer than we expected. And so that's drawing on an established set of values around preparedness, inclusion, collaboration, pragmatic adjustment. If you don't know Melissa's book on strategic nature, you can read it and see that this has been working for a very long time. But what I find important in the contemporary moment is that it's taking the anxieties and insecurities of the present moment and pre-positioning them against climate policy so that the harsh experiences many of us feel with food insecurity and energy insecurity, affordability, inflation, these are wrapped up as consequences of climate policy that was maybe too ambitious or moving too quickly or too well established for European context and climates, not ours, out of touch with the everyday needs of people. And so those insecurities are being wrapped up in a story that points at climate policy and regulations just as they're becoming more visible. And I think this is the way you're seeing industry sort of try to leverage or dampen ambition to try to slow down the timeline that Kara is talking about. And so I think that's really something we're going to have to focus on, because the climate delay is an important shift that's internal to the main participants in the oil and gas sector, but there's still a lot of climate denial circulating, as many of you with Twitter feeds will know, and they are making a concerted effort to point to things that are damaging to people and that affect people and make them nervous or anxious or real insecurities they feel and direct that at an energy transition or climate policy narrative. And we saw that with the Texas blackouts a couple of years ago. Right away, there were efforts to point to renewables in Canada, including by a sitting premier right now. So that is a piece of the narrative, the deeper narrative that I think we have to deal with, not just the specific claims and frames that come up and that are a little easier to bat away.
Thank you, Chris. Melissa, any thoughts that come up for you? I really appreciated the point that you've made, Chris, around wrapping up current insecurities as a consequence of too ambitious climate policy. And somebody in the chat said it's really good PR, to be honest. So Melissa, thoughts from you?
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, Chris, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that these narratives are very insidious. It's really a matter of connecting prevailing values and beliefs with the values and beliefs of the fossil fuel industry, making it seem as though there's compromise and collaboration. So I just want to, I have quite a few things to say on this topic. I want to start by saying that, you know, I was at an energy summit in Toronto a few years ago, and the prevailing sentiment in the room, this was actually expressed by a Suncor executive VP, is he said, I think all of us know that fossil fuels will be part of the energy mix for many, many, many years. We're looking at 50 to 100 years. So if you take that as a baseline understanding that people in the fossil fuel industry have, everything that they do has to be seen in light of that understanding that people in the fossil fuel industry have. They believe that fossil fuels will be part of the energy mix for the next 50 to 100 years. So I want to corroborate what Chris said about narratives, but I want to add to this by saying that public relations strategic planning is a lot more than just the narratives. It's not just spin, it's not just messaging. So one of the ways to think about this is to actually also contextualize the messaging so that it's not just about rebutting a particular statement or narrative, but it's about understanding where they come from. And something we were saying earlier about how recognizing how frequently these messages come up, I think is maybe one of the ways to push back on it. So just to talk about that for a second, fossil fuel industry strategies include just the formation of the coalition itself. So when I see Pathways Alliance, I'm already suspicious. What those alliances or those coalitions are often for is to shield the reputations of the individual companies so that, you know, the alliance can be seen to be speaking out on an issue, and we maybe don't remember the individual companies that are part of it. It's also, as we were saying before, about collaborating amongst those companies, sharing strategies, you know, speaking with the same voice, and so on. And as Influence Map pointed out in their report, it's also about making being able to say negative things without it being associated with a particular company. So it's really like a reputation shield and an accountability shield, these coalitions. Another thing we could look at are these voluntary compliance schemes. I mean, there are so many of them right now, but these are various sort of alternatives to regulation or legislation. For example, the GHG protocol, the greenhouse gas protocol in the United States, which a lot of companies have signed on to, is created by the World Sustainability Business Council. These are often about advancing compliance that is determined by industry. So that means the companies themselves are setting the objectives and setting the rules for what compliance looks like. So this is just really a way to sidestep the legislation or the regulation with these sort of corporate-led voluntary compliance schemes, ESG schemes. We could also look at whenever you see partial or selective disclosure, again, Influence Map talks about this, partial selective disclosure saying, you know, net zero GHG oil and gas by 2050, but not considering scope 3 emissions, suggesting that we want to, you know, we want to join on to a particular policy, but what if other countries aren't joining onto that policy? You know, that's not so great. So we're going to push the policy. So all of these kinds of selective actions, selective disclosures are also something to look at. Membership in climate action organizations. So there's you'll see a lot of rhetoric about, you know, we support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or we support various United Nations efforts, or the Paris Agreement, or et cetera. But those are usually watered down in some way, or they say we support this action along with a lot of other stakeholders. So there's no explicit commitment being made. And one more I want to point out is just non-disclosure. If an organization or a company does not want to disclose who they're working with, who are the consultants preparing the economic reports for them, who are the communication strategists, it's almost always because they have something to hide. I mean, it's not it's not more complicated than that. So what that means then is that researchers like me have to resort to a lot of proxy measures to try to assess who's producing this campaign, what are the costs, what are the cost outlays, what are the media strategies they're using. It's interesting though, you can see similarity in the rhetoric that's used, and that often is some kind of indicator. If you've been looking at, for instance, public relations strategies by a particular firm, I'll say Edelman. Edelman it's a multinational. They have branches in Canada and in the US and all over the world. You'll see some of their general rhetoric about sustainability or about climate, and then you will see that repeated by, say, the Pathways Alliance or some of their companies. And so you have a pretty good sense that they're working with Edelman, but it's not disclosed. So we have to always wonder whenever that's happening, why it is that it isn't being disclosed.
Thank you, Melissa. Kara, anything that you'd like to add on this topic of narrative or other PR strategies at play?
Yeah, I think maybe I'd like to shift a little bit, mention something on that, but shift a little bit to what we could start doing about it. So at a meeting I was at a few months ago, where our colleague James Meadowcroft from Carleton presented on research around what are sort of elements of great transitions in human history? Like, are there common elements? What sort of defines that? And one of the things that he mentioned that really stuck with me is that in every major transition, there are always the incumbents, always the actors who have the most to gain from upholding the status quo, who position themselves as actually being part of the transition and part of the solution when they have absolutely every intention to stand in the way of it. So when I read the influence map report, that is just what's screaming out of that report to me, is that, you know, that's exactly what's at play here. And it is a bit reassuring to know that it is this common element and other transitions have occurred, right? So like it is actually possible to address these incumbents. And so I think in particular, that's really critical for civil society voices who have the ability and mandate to watchdog government and corporate sector to actually lean into that. Let's start calling this what it is. Let's start revealing, you know, how much fossil fuel interests are benefiting from basically advancing three products, oil, gas, and coal, that are threatening the entirety of humanity and our existence into the future. So we need to call it what it is. We need to call out the fact that Canada can't be a climate leader if we keep expanding production and if we keep subsidizing the problem. You know, how can we say we're in an energy transition if we keep making the problem bigger? We can't. So let's call it what it is. I think it's really critical for government at all levels to be normalizing the solutions through their own work, promoting normalizing it, and not through just wonky policy plan releases, but public facing education ad campaigns that actually in a very clear and relevant way talk about the pathway, the benefits of different climate solutions. Actually seeing a pretty good job in British Columbia with the government here doing a great campaign around heat pumps that's very clever and doesn't go on and on about climate policy, but talks about how you want to start saving money and get comfort. And now that we're getting heat waves, like you're going to be cool in the summer. So really much more of that, as well as funding organizations who have authenticity and authority that perhaps government is lacking with some stakeholders. So really partnering more with others who can really convey the narratives. Think tanks, researchers, really like more of the work that Chris and Melissa are doing around exposing misinformation, but also we need it around like, what is this pathway that we're on away from fossil fuels, making it real, filling in data gaps, doing research that directly takes apart the myths of industry that are being promoted. And then I think for everyone, we've been so focused on the problem. People get we have a problem where people are really murky, and the work Amber and I have been doing over the last few years, you just see this falls apart on the what do we do about it? What is that timeline? So really clarifying, like, what does it look like for us as a whole, for different parts of the country, for your community, and for you? And people need to see there are these different actors. But I think one of the things that we're learning in our work is that the messenger is as important or can often trump the message, particularly on social media, but in other venues as well. And so we really, I don't think, I've been hitting my head against this question forever, like, can the kind of pro-environment, pro-climate actors ever speak with one voice? And I don't think that we can. I don't think that's the composition of our networks, how we work. It's also not ever going to have the scale of investment that the sector is putting into the PR. But what we do have is a whole lot of people from a whole lot of sectors who have their own story to tell about this, that have passion, that can convey the benefits, that pathway. So let's have, again, like advocates lean in on accountability, and really making sure that those lies aren't going ahead. We need the economic voices, we need the business voices, talking about what does this mean for jobs. We need the health voices talking about how gas is just really bad for us, folks. We got to move away from it. We need the Indigenous voices. We need the voices from those who advocate for affordability and the rights of low-income Canadians and others on the margin. And so I think it's like we need a choir. We don't need one message. We need a bunch of people actually speaking from their own place of authenticity and really owning this pathway conversation.
Thank you, Kara. I'm going to go over to you, Chris, before we move into questions from the audience. Are there any key recommendations or one or two recommendations that you would make given your perspective on this question?
Well, one thing that came up, and this is a minor thing, I think Karis painted the big picture that none of this works without robust public engagement and involvement of the civic sector. But one thing that came out in Melissa's remarks to me is that there is some value in mandatory things. There is some value in mandatory forms of disclosure that are now voluntary. There is some value in standardizing the way in which we count carbon emissions and count all scopes when we make claims around net zero. There is value in having Canada support these various accounting and auditing mechanisms for companies when they talk about these things. So the Task Force for Climate Disclosure, the CDP scores, these kinds of things. Canada has been lobbying against these kinds of things becoming mandatory, Canadian companies in the oil and gas sector, and especially the role of climate scenario modeling in the ways in which they generate and proliferate very utopian futures for their 50 to 100-year existence. So it's a minor thing, but I think there is value in making that mandatory and providing that transparency to people as we begin to have this public conversation. And there has been some good journalism around there. So I would read that too. Don't just circulate things from The Guardian, read Carl Mayer's stuff in the Tyee, read some of the stuff that's circulating more widely in Canadian circles and really localize this kind of conversation.
Thank you, Chris. Melissa, any recommendations, top line recommendations that you would offer for the folks here today? You're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I would say, there's people tend to divide their set of responses into, public so-called inoculation strategies, legal strategies, financial strategies, political mechanisms. I agree. The point was made by Kara earlier, like as long as fossil fuel companies are receiving subsidies from the government, it's going to be hard to make these mandatory accountability frameworks, transparency frameworks stick. So that has to happen. I totally agree with Chris that we do need mandatory accountability and transparency. I think it's very challenging in an environment where people are wondering where the government stands on this, federal and provincial. But there has been an interesting movement forward. I just throw this out there that I've been seeing in the United States, and I think moving into Canada, which is to demand accountability by the consulting firms themselves. So in other words, saying, public relations is an entirely unregulated industry. They have incredible flexibility with what they can say, what they can get away with saying. There is some emerging standards on greenwashing coming forward, but it's not going to affect public relations in the same way, because public relations is, as I said, not necessarily crafting the messages themselves. It's really about these coordinating strategies they're involved in. So forcing public relations, advertising agencies and others into a kind of accountability might be an interesting way forward. There's a movement in the US where employees of those firms who themselves don't want to work for fossil fuel clients are starting to take their bosses to task for that kind of work. So that's one interesting direction. Just having that kind of communications transparency, if we can't achieve fossil fuel company transparency, might be one way to go.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay, so we had a number of questions that came through when people registered for the webinar. So this could be like a rapid fire question and answer. But Melissa, I'm going to go to you first. So there's been a couple questions around fossil fuel advertising. So there's one here from Sandy Crawley. Has fossil fuel advertising been banned anywhere in the world? There is an active campaign here in Canada to do so. And that kind of builds on a question that we received earlier, which was, how do we unmask fossil fuel greenwashed advertising to a broader public? So you've kind of touched on that, but the second piece here around, has fossil fuel been banned anywhere else? Curious.
I am aware of a campaign in Europe. There's a series of campaigns in Europe, and the European Commission itself has been working on some campaigns, but they've been meeting some headwinds. So I don't have enough detail to really share them here, but I can always share links after this talk. Yeah, I see someone just put into the chat in Australia as well. There have been some really interesting initiatives trying to ban fossil fuel advertising. But, you know, and in general, in the US, there's an increasing push to, I want to put in quotes, regulate greenwashing, not necessarily coming from the government, coming from the Federal Trade Commission is issuing green guides, a new series of green guides. They're very complex, but they're collecting public commentary right now, trying to update and listen to people on what is actually needed in a greenwashing guide. How do you know it when you see it? I also put into the Q&A a link to an article that's a framework for assessing greenwashing that the Climate Social Science Network that I've been working with has put out. So having those kinds of frameworks in place, you know, if you can't have a ban, at least you can have a kind of checklist. I find that's a very useful educational tool to work with students, you know, really kindergarten forward. I mean, all the way up through university. I've worked with my students on this stuff. Helping people to feel like they know it when they see it is a very powerful strategy.
Thank you. For you, Kara, as well, I'm just curious if, you know, there are a couple questions here. How might we, and I think that this came from someone who works within the public sector, how might we acknowledge disinformation to the public audience? How might we, or your thoughts around mitigating the impacts of greenwashing? Anything that comes to mind for you on those two questions?
Well, I guess there's always a choice. How much energy do you put into countering a false or negative frame versus setting a new one? And I guess my gut would be, if you're in the public sector, like as I was saying earlier, let's ramp up the literacy campaigns. Let's ramp up paid media. We know we can't rely on even CBC to get the story right when they turn to this head of Pathways Alliance for a quote on the federal budget, as though that's a credible source for that kind of information. So I think it's where really we need to see a massive dial up of that kind of work. And I know there have been calls in the US, for example, as part of a group looking at strategies for putting pressure on the federal government to actually fulfill the obligation that is part of the Paris Agreement, that countries actually ensure that their citizens actually have climate literacy to the point they can take steps in their own lives to protect themselves, like a very basic survival human right kind of thing. And I guess I would like to see Canada and other governments actually implement that article and step it up. You know, that's where the resources will come at a much greater level than the civil society sector to counter the level of investment by industry going into misinformation.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge Joe Vipon put in the chat here that CAPE, which is the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, has a Competition Bureau complaint active. That's right now in conjunction with Greenpeace around the Pathways Alliance, engaging in greenwashing. That's the dog. One moment, please. For Kendra and Sophia, we had a question that came up earlier around investors seem to be turning a blind eye to the industry lobbying. What's the role of climate investors? So curious if your take on that and anything that you'd like to add in at this time based on the conversation that the panelists have engaged in.
Sure, I can address that question on investors, and thanks to all of you for such a great discussion following the presentation. Investors are one of the main users of our data at InfluenceMap. They have these direct connections with companies and contact companies that they want to push to improve or align their lobbying with Paris. They're one of many different change agents when it comes to the issue of fossil fuel greenwashing. And I think the key to this is something that Chris has mentioned a couple of times, which is transparency and disclosure. That's really where investors can help on the issue, because this is something that they have aligned on, is the need for greater disclosure and transparency from companies on what their positions are. and how they are attempting to influence policy. It's not so much a question of stopping lobbying, but understanding that lobbying and being able to peel back the curtain to the motives. And otherwise, that a lack of that transparency really is a risk to the investor community. So I think that's one area where they absolutely can continue to lead and to push on the industry.
Great, thank you. Sophia, not to put you on the spot, but also just wanting to give you an opportunity if there were any particular themes or areas that came up during the panel conversation that you'd like to just reinforce or draw connections back to the work that you do more broadly.
I think following up on discussion, one thing that Canada can do is to reduce its fossil fuel expansion, and we see a lot of even government support for new pipelines and new offshore projects. So probably instead of spotlighting CCS and all these technologies, it's more important to cut back on what science says that we need to reduce fossil fuel use. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophia. So we have one last point here made by I'm just looking for it here. I think it's Gisela Ruckert. Is there a messaging guidebook split out by which voice in the choir you are, or which audience you're speaking to? Health impacts of gas, climate impacts of continuing with fossil fuels, improving inequity through a planned transition, etc. Kara, is there any resources that, and I guess I would extend this to any of the panelists, are there resources that you know exist now that speak to this issue that we could send along either in our follow-up communications or that exist in terms of supporting communicators or folks working in this space?
Yeah, so we did a how to talk about climate and energy playbook for Canada that it has a lot of guidance, but it also links to a lot of research that's been done. Then Amber, you've been leading the great research in Alberta that provides tailored messaging based on the segment of the public that you're aiming to reach. I like the idea of having something more tailored depending on the type of spokesperson you are. So we will take that and put a note to it, because we are actively looking at expanding the research and framing work that we've been doing in Alberta to other parts of the country. We're also partnering with CAPE and doing a bit of a roll-up of what do we know about health and climate messages, and some guidance in particular around how medical professionals can talk about gas and its harms and the need to move away from it. So those are things to stay tuned for. And then on climateaccess.org, if you look in the rotating header, you'll see a link to a blog that rolls up findings from the 6 different playbooks, so Canada plus the other countries I mentioned, and you can access those all there. The Climate Access team is doing a roll-up of public opinion on gas attitudes in particular, and any message testing that's been done. And check that website out if you're not on that list. We're going to be having a webinar coming up on how to talk about gas and climate and all that stuff. So there's a lot of stuff out there. There's an ongoing work on this, and I would just say check out climateaccess.org or Re.Climate.ca, and that'll at least get you started in the right direction.
Okay.
And then also just to mention, there's Fossil Fuel Media in the US, which is a great group. And I put a link to the Clean Creatives campaign that they're running, which is an advocacy campaign exposing the big marketing agencies that are profiting off of fossil fuel clientele.
All right, with 1 minute to go, Melissa, any resources that stand out for you that may be helpful for communicators?
I was going to put Clean Creatives in, so Kara stole my thunder. CAAD, Climate Action Against Disinformation, also has some really great resources. I've been very impressed by some of their work that has shown the connection among climate disinformation and other kinds of disinformation around, for instance, COVID or other health issues. So it's just interesting to see how similar, again, the playbook is in a lot of contentious industries, not just polluting industries, although we do see a connection there. To somebody mentioned tobacco, so you see tobacco over to fossil fuels, opioids, but beyond that into broader questions of health. Again, the playbook is remarkably thin. So knowing that, I think, can be a real source of strength once we understand what's in the playbook, and then we can anticipate it and try to head it off. So those are my final thoughts there.
Thank you. Chris, for you.
Yeah, I think I would just agree with all of this. I'll just add one more, I guess. We've got Check My Ads. I don't know if they've been mentioned, and also a really interesting group. So there's a lot of vibrant, interesting things going on in this space. Check My Ads is basically looking at how to demonetize climate denial and misinformation on platforms. And so the platforms are a piece of this that we have to think about, not just legacy or hybridized media. But I wonder if we should do another webinar on some of this stuff and invite some of these groups together, because they're not all the same, but they overlap in really exciting ways. The last thing I would say is read some of these complaints. Read the one that Kate put forward and the Greenpeace put forward with respect to the Pathways Alliance. You can read them quickly. They're very illuminating. They're things that are good to read in groups, not just as a professor who runs seminars, but community groups come together all the time. I think it's really important to start to roll this up into a movement towards accountability, not just one-offs to try to scold or complain. I think these are bigger things. They're not just that. So I think that's what I would say.
Okay, a movement of accountability. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I apologize, we're 2 minutes over. We will circulate a recording of this webinar. We will include the links to the resources and the groups that we've talked about, and we'll share a blog. We have a colleague who has been listening for key takeaways. So thank you, everybody. Keep an eye out for potentially part 2, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Amber.